2005's most legendary and genre-defining classic Resident Evil 4 is one of my favorite video games of all time. I hope I'm making that crystal clear, because as much as I hold Resident Evil 4 on such a high pedestal, I still don't think that it's a perfect game. There's no such thing as a perfect game, and even though it does come real close, Resident Evil 4 is still not an exception. But since the remake got announced halfway through writing this script, and boy am I glad that happened, I have most certainly changed how I will address my few gripes, perhaps even nitpicks I have with the game. In my first few drafts, I was planning on highlighting some of the shortcomings that could be fixed in a hypothetical remake. But now that the remake is official, that is no longer the original RE4's problem to solve. It's up to this modernized reimagining to bring back some of the older concepts that didn't make it into the final cut, and perhaps even take mechanics from the final release and improve upon them. Honestly, does a remake even stand a chance at being just as good or even better than the original? We'll have to wait and see. I'll be more than happy to change my tune if it does, but until then, the original Resident Evil 4 is still without a shred of a doubt the absolute best Resident Evil has to offer. It's one of the most expertly crafted horror games, it's one of the tightest third-person shooters ever, and it is quite possibly the greatest and most fun linear single-player game I've ever played. Regardless of the time, whether it's 2005 or even now in 2022, this is not an experience you should skip. There will come a time when Resident Evil 4 will be outclassed by other masterpieces down the line, but this will always be one of the most important Resident Evil games ever developed, and will always be remembered as a video game that was way ahead of its time. Like the video, subscribe, ring the bell, and enjoy the ride.
Resident Evil 4.
So the subject's name's Ashley Graham, right?
That's right. She's the daughter of the president.
Whoever this group is, they sure picked the wrong girl to kidnap.
Take whatever measures necessary to save the subject.
I'm heading back to the village.
You'll face severe consequences.
You're supposed to be a cop or something?
Came earlier.
Is the president's daughter? Look, I know you're carriers. You've been coughing up blood, right?
You alright?
I'm fine! Leave me alone!
Ashley, wait!
What's going on?
Ashley, get out of there!
I'm never turning into one of them! Never!
Over here, right?
Just hang in there, Ashley. I'm coming for you.
Need a ride, handsome?
Been a long time, comrade.
What are we gonna do, Leon?
If I were you, I'd get off this island too.
Ashley! Where are you?
Are you okay, Leon?
A common misconception you'll hear nowadays is that Resident Evil 4 is not a survival horror game, it's a straight-up action game. You could send a spaceship to Neptune and have it accidentally end up beyond the Aquila Rift of all places, and it would still not be as far from the truth as this statement feels like. Resident Evil 4 isn't exactly that much of a straight-up action game as much as it is a survival horror game with exceptional combat mechanics that have inspired and can even rival some of the best action and action-adventure games the industry's ever put out. Even nowadays to some extent, but especially back in 2005. There are two reviews in particular for Resident Evil 4 that I always look back to with fondness, as they played a huge role in shaping how I view and understand different genres as of today. GameSpot opens his review as such. It's not enough to call Resident Evil 4 one of the highlights of Capcom's long-running survival horror series, because this is probably the single greatest horror-themed action game ever created. This was quite a fair assessment considering the time and the context. There was no other horror game like it back then, let alone one with such emphasis on confrontation. While I don't exactly agree with it being labeled as a horror-themed action game, this is still a very good explanation since the action part is one of Resident Evil 4's most prominent highlights. It doesn't dismiss horror being part of the game, and in general, it was a fantastic review. The other fantastic review from Game Trailers opens with the quote, "After a few forgettable games and a couple of laughable movies, Resident Evil 4 puts the game franchise back on top of the genre it created," and would even go on to conclude by saying, "It is the best survival horror game ever made." As far as mainstream outlets go, that is one of the most memorable closing sentences to a review that I've ever heard, and even after 15 years or however long it's been, I still remember that sentence beat for beat. When I try to get an idea for Resident Evil 4's discourse around launch back at the time, I always come back to these two reviews. This was probably the first time I was enamored by the idea of reviews being a hybrid medium of information and entertainment. Before I ever started out on YouTube, I always had my sights set on a group of particular games that I had to talk about, and Resident Evil 4 was definitely one of those. Here's the thing, I don't see the problem in labeling Resident Evil 4 as a horror-themed action game. What I do find problematic is calling it an action game for the sake of dismissing the horror elements that Resident Evil 4 offers in spades. It's actually quite a counterintuitive thing to say, because you cannot have a survival horror game without a certain degree of action. Having lots of action in a video game doesn't automatically make it a straight-up action game. If a game has the story as one of its focal points, it is most likely an action-adventure game. Most of them are. Examples of a straight-up action game would be something like Doom or boomer shooters in the same vein, or beat-em-ups or fighting games, as they're primarily, if not exclusively, concerned with reflexes and hand-eye coordination. Now that's not to say that the industry isn't saturated with pure action games, but relatively speaking, they are few and far between. I've talked about this before on my channel to some extent, and I plan to go in depth about the genre in a separate video down the line. But because the survival horror genre has become so broad, it's obviously opened itself up to lots of interpretation, which can result in lots of confusion. Confusion that I have no doubt will creep up in the comments section of this video. Getting that point across requires using lots of references from games that don't concern the topic at hand, and it also requires arguing semantics that will no doubt be tangential and time-consuming. For this video, I want to try as much as I can to only stick to what is relevant to Resident Evil 4, so allow me, if you may, to give the long and the short of it instead. The age-old question always seems to be, what is a survival horror game? And to my understanding, in its simplest and purest form, a survival horror game is simply a cross between an action-adventure game and a horror game. Basically, all survival horror games are action-adventure games, but not all action-adventure games are survival horror games. Unlike almost every other genre out there, survival horror is not just defined by its gameplay mechanics, but also by the emotional response it tries to elicit, which is basically any and every emotion associated with any of the different types of horror that exist. This is why the idea that every survival horror game needs to be modeled after Resident Evil 1 feels like such a colossal misconception. Theoretically, it's the equivalent of somebody saying that every first-person shooter since Halo or Call of Duty isn't a true first-person shooter simply because it doesn't play like the original Doom game. Or that, for example, games like Enter the Gungeon and Risk of Rain 2 aren't true roguelikes simply because they don't play exactly like Rogue, the game that spawned the entire genre to begin with. Now you might notice that I use two genres that are defined completely by the way they play, so you might be thinking that this comparison doesn't exactly apply here, and that ironically is the whole point. Even if you had to evaluate the survival horror genre by gameplay alone, these two other genres I mentioned are easy examples of how to highlight the flaws within this argument, and that's on the grounds of gameplay alone. Add something as subjective as horror into the mix, and the purest survival horror argument holds even less weight than before. This is the fundamental issue. Genres are not rigid structures, they're adaptable. The reason why some genres even exist to begin with, including survival horror itself, is because older genres that came before it were allowed to experiment and evolve over time. It's safe to say that some genres are so big they exist on a spectrum, and that a franchise like Resident Evil contributed to how huge the survival horror spectrum has truly become. If Resident Evil's always been one thing, is that it's a shapeshifter. It's that same flexibility that allows it to thrive even now after 26 years. People often say that Resident Evil wouldn't be what it is if not for the classic games, and while it does hold some truth to it, it's not the whole truth. Resident Evil 4's development lasted over 5 years, constantly undergoing new revisions and changes so that it can assure the franchise doesn't go extinct the same way every other survival horror game of that era did, while still making sure that the essence of its survival horror roots stay prevalent. That 26 years of legacy would not exist without Resident Evil 4. The This fourth numbered entry is one of the greatest phenomenons the video game industry's ever seen. It was a game built out of exceptional creative genius and a desperate need for course correction. In a recent interview with Silent Hill director Keiichiro Toyama, at this specific timestamp, Resident Evil director Shinji Mikami talks about how Resident Evil 4 is the game that he has the least of himself inserted in due to the dichotomy between his creative side, which he refers to as Mikami the creator, and his more business-oriented side, which he refers to as Mikami the producer. I don't interpret the statement as a negative, I actually find it as an overwhelming positive. It is nothing short of impressive and admirable that a director as creative and insightful as Shinji Mikami would go on to prioritize the practice of creative self-restraint instead of creative self-indulgence during the development of Resident Evil 4. This is a trap that highly esteemed creative people can easily fall into, and it happens quite often. Video games such as The Last of Us Part 2 and Death Stranding are a direct result of such a trap. This isn't to say that self-indulgence is always a bad thing, sometimes it can result in a surprisingly positive effect. Taking Death Stranding as a quick example, as frustrating as I found it, it has some of the most interesting and underutilized gameplay ideas you'll ever find in modern AAA gaming. The problem with this approach is that it doesn't try to find a balance between what a creator wants and what a player wants. It is mostly one-sided in favor of the creator, and that's not always a bad thing. Sometimes the games that the creators want to make are the games that need appreciation the most. The problem with creative overindulgence is that it can result in the same effect of creative stagnation, meaning that you can miss out on huge chunks of your audience and missing out on potential sales. These were the two creative extremes that Resident Evil 4 couldn't afford to fall into, and this is exactly the genius behind Resident Evil 4. It's this self-restraint, this creator/producer dichotomy and duality that helped Shinji Mikami create what would ultimately become his magnum opus. Statements like this, and the one where Shinji Mikami says Resident Evil 4 isn't a pure horror game, will no doubt have some people misconstruing what is being said here. This statement isn't a declaration that Resident Evil 4 isn't a survival horror game. On the contrary, it's a declaration that it's not a pure horror game. The pure horror that Shinji Mikami is talking about here has nothing to do with survival horror. It's not a general term that can be interchangeable or synonymous. This is actually a specific type of horror game, a horror subgenre that's often confused with survival horror. Survival horror is often described as having a character who's supposed to run away, always feeling underpowered, never having enough ammo, having to run away and engage in as little combat as possible. And yet here we have the pioneer of survival horror actually stating that while they're similar, they're actually distinct subgenres. In the following article, Shinji Mikami actually uses two franchises to make his distinction between survival horror and pure horror. Those two franchises happen to be Clock Tower and Silent Hill, and given the criteria around those games, it's safe to say that Forbidden Siren and something like Fatal Frame falls under the same category. The following quotes are from two different sources. Up first, a VG247 article titled, "What's the difference between horror and survival horror? Let Shinji Mikami explain." Quote, Shinji Mikami, the father of survival horror, draws a distinction between the genre he helped establish and others we in the West tend to lump together. In games in Japan, a typical horror game is something like Clock Tower or Silent Hill, but survival horror, the kind of game I like to create, is also entertainment. The horror aspect of the game and the entertainment aspect of the game have to mix together. It's a closed genre, but the difference between pure horror and survival horror is that in the latter you can defeat the monsters and feel good about it. You have to have that sense of being able to defeat a monster, even if it's tough." End quote. The following quotes come from a Game Informer article titled, "An Interview with Shinji Mikami, the father of survival horror." You are often referenced as the father of survival horror. What's it like to hold such a title? Quote, "I am proud of the fact that I have been able to create and introduce a new genre that is neither pure horror nor pure action." End quote. What are your thoughts on the current state of survival horror? Are you pleased with the direction it has taken? Quote, "It's definitely gone more towards action. This is just my personal take, but to me the definition of survival horror is a game where fear and the sense of exhilaration coincide." End quote. Now, I completely understand that different words mean different things to different people. Personally for me, if Resident Evil 4 doesn't fit that exact definition of survival horror, then I don't know what does. And while Shinji Mikami does explicitly state he doesn't have any rights to the definition of the genre, Is it even possible to find somebody with a better understanding of it? I'm a firm believer that the best way to understand a genre, regardless if it's video games, movies, or even novels, is to look at the greatest minds behind them. In my opinion, when it comes to specifically survival horror, there's two of them. There's Shinji Mikami and Glenn Schofield, creator of Dead Space and the upcoming Callisto Protocol, which frankly I'm more excited for than the Dead Space remake itself. If these two directors ever got together to make a video game, my mind would explode. But anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. I think that about sums it up as to why I think Resident Evil 4 is a survival horror game. I think there's enough context here, so let's get back to the review. In the early 2000s, the Resident Evil franchise and the old school way of conducting survival horror was growing stale. Resident Evil 4 is the game that identified the root cause of the decline and then some. It overcorrected itself to a point where it not only redefined what survival horror is truly capable of, but it accidentally created the ultimate third-person shooter in the process. Usually overcorrections spell huge disasters for other games, but lucky for Resident Evil 4, it's not other games. It's not even like the sequels that followed it. It's a game that raised the bar so high, its own franchise hasn't found a way to top it even after 17 years. It's not a perfect game and it gets proven more and more with every passing year, but time has been extremely kind to it. Despite the fact that some parts are starting to feel antiquated, the way the whole experience comes together speaks to players in a way that's universally understandable, in a way that transcends time and the innovation it itself contributed to. Resident Evil 4 is an electrifying experience, one that sent a shockwave across the entire gaming industry. It shined a light so bright that most games still live in its shadow, and the ones that don't can still most likely trace their success all the way back to this masterpiece. This game defined third-person shooters, it perfected the single-player experience, it redefined survival horror, and it solidified what it means to be a Resident Evil game. Resident Evil 4 was not the downfall of survival horror. It was a jolt to the system that it so desperately needed. Chronologically, Resident Evil 4 is the sequel to Code Veronica. Mechanically and numerically, it is the sequel to Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. And narratively, it is the sequel to Resident Evil 2. Set in 2004, 6 years after the incident of Raccoon City, fan-favorite protagonist Leon S. Kennedy returns to once again endure the worst night of his life. Gone are the days of arriving late to work in a city overrun by zombies. Leon now works as a government agent assigned to protect the president's family. It was right before he took this new position that President Graham's daughter, Ashley, was abducted, and thus a rescue operation began. There was a sighting of a girl who looked similar to her somewhere in Spain. This place seemed to be cut off from everywhere else. It was rural, isolated, and from the looks of it, technologically antiquated. There seemed to be suspicions of it being an inside job. Given the circumstances of a possible mole and unreliable intel at best, no rescue team was assembled as the agency wished to keep a low profile. Had a rescue team been formed, with greater numbers came greater odds of the suspected mole being among them, which would jeopardize the whole operation, leaving the agency with little choice but to downsize the whole operation to a one-man job, assigning one highly trained special agent tasked with reconnaissance. A chopper would also be on standby should the subject be located and require extraction. The highly trained special agent would be none other than Leon Kennedy. In this story, once again, Leon continues the trend of being somehow both the unluckiest and the luckiest guy in the Resident Evil universe. The good news is that of all the places in the world one could be sent to conduct a search, it just so happens Leon would immediately stumble upon the one place Ashley was held captive. The bad news is that, well, this place makes the depths of hell look like a utopia. Leon enters the first house just outside the village. We get a super brief cutscene reminiscent of Resident Evil 1. From the gaps in the window, we get a sense that Leon is being watched. Something ominous resides within. From the music, we anticipate someone who clearly doesn't take kindly to strangers, someone who might be malevolent, almost as if the resident is evil. From this encounter, the game immediately establishes the survival horror tone. Resident Evil 4 would be one of the first ever survival horror games that would go on to showcase that it doesn't matter whether the protagonist would be a hopeless wuss or a badass who's one hierarchy level away from being a demigod wielding a double-barreled shotgun. Resident Evil 4's entire thesis, and perhaps even this video's entire thesis as well, is that in survival horror, the action and the horror are not mutually exclusive. The stakes just have to be proportional to the character's skill set, and that is exactly what will be achieved by the end of this game. This older Leon is tougher, faster, and does not screw around. But neither do the villagers. The villagers are established as the new zombies, the new face of survival horror. Compared to the old shambling brain-dead zombies, these villagers are cunning, agile, and they have far more tricks up their sleeves. They can verbally communicate and work in large groups to overwhelm and oppress even someone as formidable as Leon himself. They even possess enough cognitive ability to wield weapons, throw them precisely, to flank you, and they can even jump across gaps and dodge your laser sight. These are not the typical George Romero zombies, and you'll even get a text description from Leon after quote-unquote neutralizing the first villager, saying he's not a zombie. Within the context of Resident Evil's lore, to Leon this obviously isn't a zombie, but within the context of our world, the real world, make no mistake, this is a zombie. Let me explain. These villagers, the Los Ganados, which roughly translates to the cattle, represent a zombie archetype that is at least 2 centuries old in documentation. The original definition of a zombie alluded to something different, something a bit more supernatural. It is said to have originated from Haitian and West African folklore, where a corpse would be resurrected via a form of witchcraft. This zombie was less of a slave of their own mind and more of a slave of someone else's. They originally had one purpose, and it was not to eat brains. It was to do their master's bidding. Unless their master's bidding is to eat somebody else's brains, which in that case, well, I don't know what to tell you. I just pulled a reverse card on myself. This is awkward now. Although it is said that voodoo practices are not related to this ritual, they are still referred to as voodoo zombies. The Ganados are a more grounded depiction of that folklore, designed to fit better into the lore of eugenics and bioorganic weapons of the Resident Evil universe. It's a really clever twist on the concept, one that is suitable for both the action-oriented combat and the heightened, unparalleled sense of fear in the moment-to-moment gameplay. The Ganados are perfectly named. They aren't brainless, but they also cannot be reasoned with. And sometimes throwing a quick-thinking individual into the pit of a mindless herd mentality is as dangerous and distressing as it can get. Resident Evil 4's village sequence illustrates this perfectly, and it's one of the strongest video game openings to date. It takes an unbelievable amount of skill and talent to create an opening that is this simultaneously terrifying and entertaining at the same time. The game wastes no time setting up the horror tone, the tension, and the atmosphere so that the action can kick in as soon as possible. And yet the horror that's been established here, even though it's in a different approach, is just as effective as it was in the previous games. The slow burn horror of the older games gets diluted because it's a kind of horror that trickles out over time. For the scares to be effective, they require jump scares as a punchline. Resident Evil 4 is more like your drinking buddy. It dares you to chug all the horror all at once, blunt and straight to the point. Because they happen in a significantly shorter time frame, the scares are not diluted like in previous games, and so they don't require a jump scare for the punchline to work. It's a more visceral, more immediate kind of horror, and far more violent than ever before. The frights come in short bursts, but they are potent and effective, striking a perfect middle ground between a cheap jump scare and a Hitchcockian slow burn suspense. Every fight from here on out will keep you on your toes and looking over your shoulder, and the village sequence is a masterclass at setting this up. If you thought becoming a Jill sandwich was a problem, then ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the Leon Crimson Bread. Get it? Cause Crimson Head? Was that pun a bit too much? Yeah, probably. The best thing about this opening is that it sets up the perfect expectations. It's a promise of what lies ahead. Impeccable pacing, phenomenal atmosphere, fun level design, cheesy one-liners, a balance of terror and levity, satisfying combat, and twists and turns that will keep you guessing until the end of the game. Resident Evil 4 was revolutionary for several reasons, but it can be argued that its single greatest contribution to both its own franchise and the gaming industry in general was how it popularized the new over-the-shoulder camera and precise aiming controls. It was a bold change that set the new baseline and went on to inspire every third-person shooter from 2005 until now. The most shocking thing about Resident Evil 4's shooting mechanics is not just how tactile it all feels, it's how far more responsive and satisfying it feels in a frantic game such as this one than it does in most frenetic action and action-adventure titles. Games that use far more accessible controls than RE4 could ever dream of. Keep in mind, this game uses tank controls. Don't let the camera fool you just because it follows you everywhere, because this is still 100% a tank control scheme in every sense of the word. The only difference now, visually, is that it looks less like a classic Resident Evil game and more like a classic Tomb Raider game. Tank controls usually don't lend themselves well to shooting or combat in general. Even in Tomb Raider, it was somewhat clunky at best and problematic at its absolute worst. So believe me when I say Resident Evil 4, a game with tank controls, is more fun and amazing to control than it has any right to be. These are the most well-optimized tank controls of any game I've ever played. Even Resident Evil 5 doesn't come close, which is odd considering how on the surface the gameplay seems identical. And I do want to put emphasis on the word seems, because comparing these two games is like comparing apples to oranges. Sure, they're both technically a fruit, but that doesn't mean they're the same. These two games get clumped together often in a discussion, but something definitely got lost in translation from one to the other. Maybe it's just me, but Resident Evil 4's controls feel way more snappy and responsive. Leon is nimble as all hell and is not burdened by long-winded animations, which for a game that has some of the coolest handcrafted animations, that's quite an achievement. When it comes to survival horror, one of the most common disputes seems to be over movement fluidity or lack thereof. For the longest time, there was this notion that clunky, unresponsive controls lead to a feeling of helplessness, and that the amount of horror is directly proportional to how helpless you truly feel. That notion can only go so far. Helplessness indeed plays a pivotal role in scaring the player. However, one has to ask themselves, where is the helplessness truly coming from? What exactly is horror all about? In essence, it's the fear of losing control. But the question is, control over what? The horror in question pertains to survival, and so the survival instinct is about fearing external factors that you have no control over. Things such as predators and unforeseen circumstances. These fears are hardwired into us because they are out of our control, and so to survive, your only tools at your disposal are the factors that you can control. These are the internal factors. It's your way of thinking, planning, outsmarting, making the right decisions, controlling your emotions in desperate times. This is often the missing puzzle piece within the argument of helplessness through clunky controls. The key to great horror isn't specifically helplessness, but rather helplessness as a means of creating immersion. If the controls are not intuitive, are you really terrified of the external factors the game wants you to have no control over? Or are you actually terrified of how you've grossly underestimated the lengths the game will go to screw you over? Survival is all about taking advantage of your internal factors to overcome the external ones, and so helplessness should come from everywhere but within, because you are all you have left. I think the biggest takeaway here is that it's not really about being helpless as much as it is about the illusion of helplessness. So when a common dispute such as how is RE4 even remotely frightening if the protagonist is so athletic is put on the table, that very same point of contention is ironically the answer to that question. I feel like the added mobility complements the horror, and it's more well thought out than it gets credit for. For every empowering new move or ability, there's a counterbalance of some sort. Just to name a few examples, Leon might be fast, but he cannot strafe left and right. He can't just sprint off in the opposite direction. Every quick turn costs time, and that split second can cost him his life. The camera plays an essential role as to why the death scenes are so effective at feeling utterly horrifying. This new perspective gives a far more realistic hindrance of the character being unable to see what's behind them instead of what's in front of them, which makes it more immersive. Despite the unequivocally beautiful artistry of the fixed camera angles, I sometimes found them to be immersion breaking when it came to tension building. Not that they never worked, because that would be an exaggeration, but when they did, I noticed it was mostly the sound design and the music that was doing most of the heavy lifting. Take away the sound from the equation and examine the camera on its own merits, the idea that a zombie is just off screen, but the main character can clearly see them, it always came across as stilted and weak, much like a cheap jump scare is. The fundamental problem stems from the fact that there's a disassociation, a disconnect between what a player sees through a screen and what the character sees through the world. The over-the-shoulder camera fixes this problem and aligns the two together, creating a far more immersive experience. The camera is pulled away just enough for us to have some situational awareness, but at the same time it's always close enough to the character's back, allowing for some surprises to occur from just beyond the corners of the screen without running the risk of coming across as cheap. This kind of unpredictability is actually manageable with enough practice, as Leon and every other playable character can telegraph an enemy approaching by looking to their sides. To put into perspective just how ahead of its time this little detail was, God of War 2018, for example, perfectly demonstrated how surprise attacks from from off-screen can lead to a frustrating experience. Resident Evil 4 came in locked and loaded with the perfect solution right out of the gate all those years ago. Another subtle yet equally important detail in how the game creates its terror lies within Leon himself. RE4 doesn't actually have an on-screen reticle. Instead, it opts for something diegetic and far more immersive to the game's world. Every weapon instead uses a laser sight, and a shaky one at that. It's actually incredible just how much care and thought was put into the details of such a small visual cue. Every single weapon's laser sight trembles in a different way depending on the size of the weapon and how difficult it might be to wield. You even get the option to enhance the stability of some weapons by buying a stock from the merchant. Equipping a stock will help Leon to keep a steadier hand when aiming. With this one small added detail, Resident Evil found a clever way to contextualize the necessity to stop moving before you're about to shoot. Through the visual language conveyed, the player is given a valid explanation of how several things work. Through the aiming pose, it tells you that weapons have significant weight. Through the weight, it tells you that aiming guns is tough and even tougher under severe pressure. And finally, through Leon's composure, it tells you that he definitely knows his way around a gun, or 17. The only thing that's left open to interpretation really is whether Leon struggles with some weapons more than others, or that he is simply scared to death, or whether it's a mix of both. Even the ambiguity in and of itself is telling you something. It establishes a deep relatability between the player and the character, a deep sense of empathy. It tells you that Leon, above all else, is a fallible human being, somebody who's risking his neck, in the most literal sense of the word mind you, to save one person from a whole cult. It is the ultimate nightmare that will sculpt the ultimate hero. I guess it really does take a village. This type of horror build-up feels more organic as it forces you to always mind your surroundings. The older camera system, unfortunately, was just a one-time fright. Once you know where the jump scare is, you'll always know it. But with an over-the-shoulder camera, it's now an unpredictable and evergreen system. You are no longer memorizing where the jump scares are, because now the jump scares are the death scenes themselves. And they can happen anywhere, anytime, and in a countless different ways. Resident Evil 4 has some of the most disturbing death animations in video game history. To this day, it still stands as the most violent Resident Evil game of them all. The last 4 games were developed on the RE engine, an engine designed with photorealism in mind, and even they feel a bit tame in comparison. There's simply no other Resi game with as many creative and unique death animations. There's a handcrafted death scene for every failed QuickTime event, and deaths during real-time gameplay are no slouch either. As somebody who's grown so accustomed to the predictabilities of survival horror games but has a weakness to decapitations and loud, sharp sounds in general for some reason, it's not that hard to see why RE4 ranks so high on my personal list of the scariest Resident Evil games. Objectively speaking, I would never go as far as to say that it's the scariest Resident Evil game, but what's fascinating about this one is that, for me, it's oddly the one Resident Evil game where the horror elements never seem to have subsided, even after all of these years. When I'm about to get a game over screen in other RE games, I just accept it and restart. With RE4 though, it really doesn't matter what year and what console port I'm playing it on. If I have the music cranked up loud and I hear a Dr. Salvador, a Garador, or Novistador, I'm running for dear life. But it's not just the damage inflicted on you as a character that feels gut-wrenching. The damage you deal to them is just as visceral. Resident Evil 4 retains all of the gameplay elements found in previous titles. You still look for keys, you still solve ridiculous puzzles and avoid even more ridiculous contraptions. Moving while shooting isn't allowed, there's ammo conservation and even heavy inventory management. You still have to defeat bosses and you still have some time to do some exploration when things aren't so hectic. The one real glaring difference now is that the time allocation between all these different things has been drastically altered. Since combat takes center stage, it shouldn't come as a shock as to why the shooting feels so exceptionally polished. Combat is by far the most predominant system you will engage with, and every other single activity is implemented in such a way that does not interfere with the fast-paced nature of this system. The horror buildups are effective, but they never drag. The story keeps throwing crazier enemies at every single turn, adding to the nail-biting tension and creating lots of frantic fights. And the plethora of memorable set pieces contain just enough QuickTime events to keep you uneasy, yet invested at all times. Resident Evil 4 does have some puzzles, and a couple of them might take some light problem solving on the first run, but they really just take a backseat. They're not really intrusive, and it's a deliberate choice on the game's part so that it can maintain the exhilarating pacing, and you will most likely breeze through them on subsequent playthroughs. The most time-consuming activity you will be engaging in apart from combat is organizing your inventory system. The game ditches the 6 to 10 item slots from previous games and replaces them with an attaché case in the style of a Tetris minigame. This overhauled grid system eliminates the old issue of items taking up the same space regardless of their size. In prior games excluding Resident Evil 0, it made zero difference whether you obtained a key small enough to be made for ants or a spaceship that is big enough to fit Albert Wesker's ego. Every item, regardless of size, took up exactly one slot, and even by Resident Evil standards it never made sense. The new grid system completely fixes this problem, with every individual item occupying a unique set of squares as a means of accurately depicting it on a two-dimensional plane. The system accurately represents every item's proportions, giving some items a greater sense of importance than others. This is essential due to how much item management you'll need to do throughout the 15 to 20 hour runtime, facilitating the decision-making process on items you can live without. It demands a whole lot of your time, but at the same time it also respects it. If you had to compare the pros and cons of the attaché cases between Resident Evil 4 and 8, the one in 4 actually comes out on top as the superior system overall. If a newly obtained item overlaps with a previous item, the items are then swapped and you can immediately move the previous one somewhere else. The items' colors and details are also accurately depicted here as they are during gameplay, making them quite easy to distinguish, and each different item you equip gives Leon a different pose in the menu, which is a nice little detail. But above all else, the biggest reason as to why Resident Evil 4's attaché case is the superior one is because it is meaningful. You always have just enough space for the things you need, but not necessarily for the things you want. Fitting everything requires a little bit of thinking outside the box, and the game slowly but surely lets you unlock bigger suitcases exactly when the time calls for them. It is an excellently balanced progression. That being said, it's not a perfect system, and honestly it does feel a little bit dated in some places. Don't get me wrong though, Resident Evil 4's attaché case is by far the most fun you can have with a Resident Evil inventory system. It's so fun you could create a whole game around it. The big problem here mostly stems from the lack of weapon shortcuts and the slight delay when opening the menu. Because of how long and fast-paced the game is, it can get tiresome having to switch between different weapons all the time, and the menu delays can exacerbate that feeling of the pacing slowing down to a halt. And don't even get me started on the OCD. It can get so tiresome having to open the menu every time and being guilt-tripped into rearranging everything over and over and over and over. Please game, don't do this. I have a wife and kids. It was so close to being perfect, and a quick swapping feature could have been the perfect icing on the cake.
Got something that might interest you.
For the first time in Resident Evil history, RE4 added something called the Merchant, a new NPC and now a fan-favorite character that introduced the concept of buying and upgrading weapons as an essential gameplay mechanic. The weapon selection isn't that particularly extensive, but it goes for quality over quantity, and the quality is exceptional. Throughout the game, you'll unlock a lot of amazing weapons, and the Merchant has a different line of dialogue for every single one of them. If this guy had a penny for every memorable quote, he could rebuild the entire Spencer mansion. Hell, he could rebuild Raccoon City and start his own television show. If you include the unlockable weapons, the Merchant can sell you anything from 5 handguns, 3 shotguns, 2 sniper rifles, a fully automatic machine pistol, a submachine gun, a mine thrower, 3 magnums, a single-use rocket launcher, an infinite rocket launcher, and a sci-fi laser cannon called the PRL-412. You can also buy attachments like scopes, stocks, and tactical vests. In the upgrades menu, you can level up weapon stats such as firepower, fire rate, magazine size, and reload speed. No two guns are the same, and all of them are perfectly viable for a whole playthrough regardless of difficulty. With the exception of the Killer 7 Magnum, fully upgrading the weapon of your choice will unlock an upgrade that is specific to that weapon. The exclusive upgrade will either amplify one of the 4 stats to a ridiculous level, or it can change how the weapon works, giving it a completely new playstyle. The weapon upgrades offer a lot of fun, light RPG mechanics, and the excellently balanced linear progression ensures that you can mix and match a variety of weapon builds to your heart's content. You can also buy single-use rocket launchers that can trivialize difficult boss fights. I've seen some people argue about how they're too cheap for how good they are, but these are obviously made for newcomers who are having a hard time finding treasures and selling items. So when you think about it, the selling price is actually steep enough because it's not catering for people who want a challenge. If you want a challenge, you don't buy it. It's that simple. You can make the game as hard or as easy as you want, and at the end of the day, it's completely optional and it doesn't hurt anyone. In fact, it probably does the opposite and encourages more people to want to play it. So play it how you want to play. Your starting handgun is the iconic Silver Ghost. It doesn't do much damage in early game, but you will be handsomely rewarded if you commit to it and stick with it from beginning to end. I promise you that on professional mode, this is the best handgun you can get. Every weapon in this game has a distinct name and a distinct sound that gives it its own unique feel and character. The Silver Ghost doesn't sound like it has quite the kick, but it makes a satisfying popping sound. And this is not by coincidence, because the exclusive upgrade actually increases this weapon's chance for a critical headshot by 5 times, making it the easiest gun to pop headshots with and making it the most effective handgun in the game. Statistically speaking, the Punisher is the weakest handgun, but its unique attribute is its armor-piercing power, and you can actually get a good sense of that just from the sound alone. You can hear each bullet rapidly scrape the inside of the barrel with such a high pitch, perfectly depicting that sensation of a bullet so thin, so supersonic, and so sharp it can literally puncture through anything. It is a great weapon against enemies with shields, and with the exclusive upgrades it can shoot through 5 whole granados if you can line them all up, making it a surprisingly good crowd control weapon. I used to have such a disdain for this gun in the past, but after recently giving it a fair shake, I'm convinced that I underestimated this gun. In one particular run that I did, I had both the Blacktail and the Punisher, and I found myself using the Punisher for the majority of the run. If that doesn't tell you everything you need to know, then I don't know. Seriously, try giving it a shot on professional mode. You'll be surprised at how good this handgun is if you're resourceful. The Red 9 is the handgun that steals the show. This is Luis Serra's preferred handgun, tried and tested. Its beautiful and unique look makes it stand out immediately. If looks could kill, this gun wouldn't even need ammo. If you equip the wooden stock and buy the exclusive upgrade, you get the most statistically powerful handgun in the game, and you can bet your bottom dollar you'll know it the moment you hear it. Every shot packs an immense punch, and you can hear the ferocity in the sound mixing. Every time you fire, you can hear a perfect blend of a booming shot and a fierce metallic ring. It's one of the greatest gunshot sound effects of all time, and the sound of the reload and the animation itself are just as beautiful. The Blacktail has the fastest firing speed out of all the handguns. It comes with a sleek design and great firepower right out of the gate. This pistol is a great middle ground between the swiftness of the Punisher and the power of the Red 9, resulting in a sound effect that feels reminiscent to that of the Silver Ghost, but with a greater echo and a bigger punch. Unfortunately, this weapon relies on DPS to be effective, making it particularly useful against bosses, but at the cost of wasting plenty of ammo. It's statistically the second best handgun in terms of raw firepower, and the magazine size is just enormous. This used to be my favorite handgun because it starts out with excellent stats. However, I've slowly come to realize that maxing this one out actually offers the most diminishing returns. I've eventually come to understand that this gun is simply a jack of all trades and a master of none, making it the least optimal handgun for my particular playstyle. There's actually nothing wrong with that. In fact, this is one of the greatest weapons you can start out with if you're a beginner, but it's just not for me. The starting shotgun is particularly effective in the village section, but it gets quickly overshadowed when the later shotguns become available. This shotgun has quite a unique exclusive upgrade, allowing it to deal the same firepower at long distance as it does at point blank. Sadly, this upgrade isn't as useful as it sounds, but the longer range compared to the other shotguns does give it a unique tactical playing field. This shotgun and the following one share the exact same sound effect, and it's not just one of my favorite shotgun sounds, but one of the most thrilling weapon sounds of any video game ever. Every shot feels powerful. You can feel it scatter and spread through every roaring sound that it makes. And the gaps between every shot and every pump has a steady rhythmic feel to it that makes it audibly delightful to no end. I simply can't get enough of how good it sounds. The Riot shotgun is a better alternative all around. It's basically the same shotgun, but it looks cooler, and purchasing the exclusive upgrade turns it into the most statistically powerful and accurate shotgun in the game. The Striker is an interesting deviation from the previous two shotguns. Its firepower is no match for the Riot shotgun, but it offers so many advantages. It's stylish, it takes less inventory space, it fires faster, and the spread on this thing is simply insane. For its relatively smaller size, it feels and sounds surprisingly bulky. A fully maxed out Striker can hold a ginormous 100 shells and can clear out an entire room within seconds, making it the ultimate crowd control weapon. Some weapons are all about style, some weapons are all about substance, but the bolt-action rifle is a weapon where the style is the substance. This is surprisingly a stellar survival horror weapon. The kick sounds incredible, but it's a highly stable weapon, and just like the pump action on the shotgun, the bolt action on this rifle has a satisfying rhythm to it. Popping off headshots is like popping bubble wrap with this thing, but the bolt action reloading is so time consuming that the incredible firepower could come at the cost of losing your head. On the bright side, if you're gonna die, at least you're gonna go out like a badass. What the semi-automatic rifle lacks in style, it makes up for with practicality. The gunshots feel similar to the bolt action, but with louder echoes that make it feel far more devastating. It's got great firepower, the firing speed is an improvement, and with the exclusive upgrades, it fires even faster than you can sell pastizi at a Maltese shop. It's also got a large magazine, and the reload speed is super quick. It will make your life a lot easier. The TMP might look and sound weak at first, the gunshots feel unremarkable, but it's actually the most versatile and useful gun in the whole game. The ammo isn't all that valuable, but it is plentiful. Using it to kill Ganados isn't all that effective in the early game. You're actually better off targeting specific limbs to initiate melee attacks. It's a great way to save lots of ammo in the long run for situations such as boss fights, and you might find yourself depleting all your resources without it. Equipping the stock and completing all the upgrades will turn this little machine pistol into the most well-rounded weapon you'll ever have in any situation. The Broken Butterfly is my personal favorite Magnum. It gives you the most bang for buck on a first playthrough, it's the most stylish Magnum in the game, and the sound on this thing is breathtaking. And in the case of the Ganados, I mean that quite literally. The bullet friction sounds so metallic and sharp you can almost smell that barbecue emanating from the screen. With a little bit of backtracking, you can actually get this Magnum for free. It's actually not the most powerful Magnum, but when maxed out, the firepower is still overkill at 50 points. You don't even need anything above that, and of the two Magnum revolvers that you can obtain, this one fires faster, is more accurate, and it handles a lot better. And the reload on this thing is perfection. The Killer 7 is a unique semi-automatic pistol labeled as a Magnum in this game, and it pays homage to a weapon from another Capcom game of the same name. As far as Magnums go, the Killer 7 isn't the best or even the cheapest option to upgrade, but it's got a sleek and modern look to it, and it starts out with almost double the firepower of a Broken Butterfly. It also has better firing speed, can hold more bullets, reloads a lot faster, and it has better stability. Despite actually being a pistol, the gunshots sound identical to the Broken Butterfly revolver. It seems odd, but hey, if it ain't broken, no pun intended, don't fix it. The Killer 7 is also the only upgradable weapon with no exclusive upgrade. The Mine Thrower is the most interesting wild card. The good news is it's the most dangerous weapon in the game. The bad news is it's also the most dangerous weapon in the game. Also, it doesn't sound like any other gun. The sound of each fired dart is pneumatic, and each puncture is followed up by a loud beep that rhythmically accelerates until everything goes boom. It can deal massive amounts of AoE damage, and the exclusive upgrades turns each shot into a homing missile of destruction. It could be a very useful weapon, but shoot it at the wrong place in the wrong time and it's gonna be a bloodbath. Weirdly enough, RE4 doesn't have a grenade launcher, but you can actually equip 3 types of hand grenades. Frag grenades deal the most damage of the 3, and they're excellent at crowd control. Incendiary grenades don't deal as much damage, but they do enough to stun the Ganados and drop them to the ground, and it's also really somehow effective against the big cheese. For the longest time I had never picked up on these little things, but the burning building is actually hinting at the fire being his main weakness. It isn't actually the only time the game tells you a boss's weakness through environmental storytelling. It might not have been too obvious, but the Krauser knife scene was actually far more than just a flashy moment and actually served as a foreshadowing for the boss's main weakness. The flash grenade is a get-out-of-jail-free card. It stuns enemies and it instantly kills the Las Plagas parasites. But the best thing about this grenade is this.
Bingo, 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 bingo.
We're not even done with the weapons yet. Now it's time for the special unlockables. The Matilda handgun returns from Resident Evil 2 as Leon's trusty sidearm. Equipped with a stock and a 3-burst fire rate, this handgun is both fast and lethal. In terms of damage per second, this is an excellent handgun, but the downsides are pretty hard to ignore. The space that this weapon takes in your inventory is frankly better off saved for handgun bullets. And speaking of bullets, this thing eats them up faster than a mugbanger can sweat them on pizzas. Long story short, it's got the same ammo depletion problem as the Blacktail, which is why I don't use either one of them. The PRL-412 is by far the most outlandish weapon in the game. It's a sci-fi, or rather a science fantasy, laser cannon. This weapon can emit blinding flashes of light or concentrate them into a narrow and lethal beam of devastation. This gun used to be really fun back in the good old PS2 days, but on the remaster, this weapon got the opposite of being nerfed. Calling it stupidly overpowered is somehow an understatement. It's now omnidirectional and it takes a fraction of the time it used to take to charge. It's not enough to say that it trivializes the original intended experience, because honestly, it destroys it. That sheer sense of thrill has simply been wrung dry, dragging what was once a top-of-the-line S-tier weapon all the way down to the bottom of the barrel. The infinite rocket launcher, on the other hand, is simply amazing. Is it absolutely broken? You bet your sweet bippy it is, but damn is it satisfying to clear New Game Plus with it. All you gotta do is sit back, relax, and enjoy the fireworks. The hand cannon might not be the most practical magnum, but it might just be the most satisfying weapon to unlock. Trying to get 5-star rankings with every mercenary on every map is such a nail-biting experience. It's not my favorite revolver, but you cannot deny the badassery of this gun. When this thing goes off, you don't even hear a metallic ring. What you get instead is a demolishing, roaring thunder. When you shoot this thing, you almost feel like the barrel's just about to break down and cry. Most likely because it cannot handle all the awesomeness. I think this gun escaped from Yarn because it is an absolute beast. And saving what is quite possibly the coolest gun in the game for last, the Chicago Typewriter. This gun basically feels and sounds like an overpowered TMP, dishing out 5 times as much damage and 12 times the awesomeness. But the best thing about this gun has to be how it comes in 2 different variations depending on which outfit you select. When selecting the normal costume or the RPD uniform, the Chicago Typewriter comes in its standard form, equipped with a long magazine and a conventional reload animation. But if you select the gangster outfit, the Typewriter's features are altered, now sporting a second grip and a drum magazine that fits the era and aesthetic of a 30s gangster. And the reload turns into this. At the start of Chapter 2, the game's user interface starts to display 2 health gauges instead of 1. A new name pops up on that second gauge. Ashley. The moment you see that is the moment Resident Evil 4 turns into an escort mission. Usually those 2 words are the last thing a gamer ever wants to hear, that or sewer levels. But what we are actually witnessing here is RE4 taking an eye-rolling gimmick such as an escort mission and actually making something ironically useful out of it. Hate and vitriol is a popular bandwagon these days, and Ashley is the scapegoat. I've played my fair share of games with obnoxious escort missions and fragile sidekicks, and honestly I've yet to see a game execute on the idea more efficiently than RE4 does with Ashley. Never has a damsel in distress been interwoven so successfully into the fabric of video games. If horror is what you get when you have tension and power is what you get when you let go, then Ashley would be the quintessential arrow applying tremendous pressure on that survival horror bowstring. As far as the game design goes, Ashley's obnoxiousness is a good sign. Take pain receptors. They annoy us. We all wish they didn't stop by the front door what seems to be every 2 minutes, and yet the irony is we'd be worse off without them. We tend to confuse the signals to the actual malice these receptors are so desperately trying to warn us about. In that sense, Ashley is much like a pain receptor. If she's being insufferable, good. That means she's doing her job. The question is, are you? Usually these types of sidekicks are devoid of gameplay consequences, as evidenced by Ellie in The Last of Us and Elizabeth in BioShock Infinite. They have total immunity, unable to get hurt and unable to die. This creates an inconsistency between the stakes of the plot and the actual stakes presented in real-time gameplay. It's done on purpose to relieve both the player and the developer of the headaches and unforeseen complications that may occur. After witnessing what happened with Resident Evil 5's AI, you can't really blame the developers for taking the smarter route. In games like BioShock and The Last of Us though, these are clever omissions as the gameplay is secondary, a sequence of semi-interactive gaps that are there to serve the story, not the other way around. It is narratively brilliant and mechanically vapid. Ashley is neither of those things, and yet she is so much more. See, the thing about Ashley is that she is a walking paradox. She's a simple character, yet she's so integral. She's utterly useless, and yet that's precisely what makes her so useful. She can't handle weapons, and yet can still hold her own in some situations. She's extremely codependent, and yet she also gets a few moments of complete autonomy. She's the whole point the story even exists, and yet she barely matters in her own story. This could lead to many considering her as dead weight, but what she actually is the heart of Resident Evil 4's survival horror. Horror is an emotional response to a threatening obstacle. It's the body's way of alerting itself to deal with a problem as fast as possible. Making it out alive by itself is an overwhelming problem as is, but what happens if you add another overwhelming problem? What happens if you add another human being to the situation? That can go one of two ways. The first one is the way of Resident Evil 5, where the sidekick is just as capable as you are. Within the context of the genre, it simply doesn't work. That's not survival horror, that's action-adventure co-op. You're not locked in the village with them, they're locked in the village with you. Then there's the way of Resident Evil 4, where the sidekick is not your safety net, she is your responsibility. Yours and yours alone, rendering the situation both emotionally and mechanically nerve-wracking. This is the peak of when both the fear and the exhilaration coincide. This, on the other hand, is survival horror. The reason Leon can afford to be such a strong character is because Ashley's helplessness evens it all out. Ashley's greatest accomplishment as an NPC and as an escort mission is that she is useful in her uselessness. She represents the balance between the two core pillars of survival horror, action, adventure, and horror, and she is also a visible representation of the gradual power shift between the hero and the oppression. When Ashley cowers in fear, Leon towers over her and the Ganados, representing him as a force to be reckoned with. The over-the-shoulder camera plays a big part in how this power struggle is visually manifesting itself. The camera sits at a lower angle, conveying the protagonist as dominating, and it's pulled even further back than usual, giving him a sense of composure and full control over his surroundings. The widened field of view during these segments can even meticulously craft the illusion that when Ashley is in danger, Leon's senses are heightened because his instinct to protect kicks into full gear. The whole escorting mechanic comes down to a simple binary option. Ashley can either follow you along, or she can wait and hide somewhere safe. The latter option should not be underestimated, however you don't always have that luxury, and Ashley's vulnerability will absolutely complicate things. She isn't an invincible NPC, she is quite literally a target on your back. The enemies will take her away from you, and this is where Resident Evil 4 gets the sidekick component right. Ashley does two amazing things. She always stays close, and she never gets in the way. If she ends up in the line of fire, she'll duck. If you run away, she'll keep up with you. And if she gets grabbed, she will scream her lungs out for help. Ashley's loud voice does seem to be at the center of all complaints about her, but it is essential. That high-pitched sound is an effective way to signal trouble to the player. It's distinguishable, unmistakable, a call for action. There are two ticking clocks in Resident Evil 4. One is for getting out alive, and the other one is for finding a cure. The moment when Ashley gets taken away creates a third, smaller ticking clock, one that will surely run out in a matter of seconds. The high-pitched yelling paired with the unsettling music and sounds and the limited reaction time creates a taxing burden on the player. The protagonist needs to act fast with heavy weight on their shoulders, and sometimes you never know when an enemy might literally take that weight off of you. Although it can feel a bit dated, Resident Evil 4 is still brimming with excellent presentation and sound design. Few games have such a strong identity from beginning to end, and such an accomplishment in a game that's this long is almost unheard of. Resident Evil 4 retains the 3-location structure of previous games, with each location possessing a distinct soundscape and a unique visual language. The quality of the visuals fluctuate a bit in the 3rd location, but the sound design stays top-notch and memorable from beginning to end. Keeping with the traditions, the starting village area is the strongest and the most iconic location. The visuals consist of lots of browns. From Leon's starting jacket, the complementing browns in his hair, the fallen leaves, the dead trees, the houses, the dirt and the grime, all the way to the rust and traces of dried up blood. The sound of crows cawing up in the sky and on top of branches. You can hear a light breeze passing through both diegetic and non-diegetic sounds, and paired with the thin fog, the general audio-visual makeup gives this rural setting a feeling of coldness and isolation. The villagers go on with their daily lives, attending to their chores and their farming. The cows just stand in the barn all clueless as they witness the bloodshed, and dogs can be heard barking around the farm. The village has a strong horror vibe that feels like a mix between the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and The Witch, and the iconography gives it that impression of a dark and twisted fairy tale. The castle swaps the folklorish vibe for something more medieval and occultist. The architecture looks old, but the environments are cleaner and more intricate. There's a great sense of scale within the echo and the reverb, from the footsteps to the sound of breaking a vase to the grandiose metallic doors. Crickets chirp and the wind permeates across the castle's courtyards and through the cracked open windows in the upper levels. Zealots chant "Morir es vivir" in an incessant and unsettling tone, and the music's tempo has now become both more frantic and frenetic, giving the castle a greater sense of urgency than the village. Water constantly drops from sewer pipes and onto puddles on the ground, all while the Novistadors hide in plain sight. The Garadors tread lightly around different parts of the castle, while chains they were once confined to now dangle on their bodies, swinging like a pendulum as if to symbolize a ticking clock before they lose themselves in a fit of rage. Where the village's biggest strength was how uniform the presentation felt, the castle's greatest strength is the variety. It's a showcase for the game's most beautiful and diverse locations, vistas, enemy encounters, different styles of architecture, arena layouts, and fluctuations between horror and action moments. The same way the starting locations tend to be the visually strongest, the island unfortunately also keeps with the tradition of the closing location being visually the blandest and the weakest. The island section falls into the same old trap of vapid, industrial gray level design. It's like Code Veronica all over again. There's still enough variety going on from level to level, but the general feeling is always that of dirt, ruins, rock, and metal. It's a bit dull at times. Fortunately, what it lacks in color, it makes up for with sheer spectacle and stunning cinematography, as the island goes all out with the craziest and wildest set pieces of the game. The 3rd location in Resident Evil games tend to be the shifting point from survival horror to a horror-themed action-adventure game, and in that regard, Resident Evil 4 is no different. What is different about Resident Evil 4's final location, though, is how even though the action cranks up to a point of no return, oddly enough, it's also where you'll find the scariest enemies in the game. The Regenerators and the Iron Maidens are absolute nightmare fuel. Upon first encounter, you don't even see it. You hear it gnarling and breathing heavily from behind a lab door. It makes a sound so unsettling and so distinct that the developers intentionally prohibit you, the player, from visually identifying them and instead rely on audible cues to get both a sense of where they are and a sense of how long before you will end up scared shitless. The majority of these encounters actually happen without Ashley, and yet these moments can reach the same heights of vulnerability. Your first brush with these abominations will have you confused and clueless, as they keep regenerating their limbs and seem to have no visible weak spots. These encounters are a weird tonal shift for such an action-dependent location, and perhaps it is specifically that whiplash you get from the contrast that makes these encounters so terrifying. This whiplash can also come from the juxtaposition between the horror segments and the equally cheesy and iconic lines delivered by the voice actors.
So maybe you have 9 lives, but it doesn't matter now, Mr. Kennedy. I've sent my right hand to dispose of you.
Your right hand comes off?
Say whatever you please. Die, you worm!
Oh, excuse me, Your Highness. Perhaps the young lady might want to introduce herself first before asking someone his name.
In order to give her our power, and then send her back.
No. Leon, I think they shot something in my neck.
What did you do to her?
Don't worry. I'll take good care of it.
Ada!
Gotta go. If I were you, I'd get off this island too.
She really pushed it. There's one in the north, and the other in the east. And let me guess, you got the last one. It pretty much means you're on a tight leash.
Over here, stranger.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
Resident Evil 4 is quite the outlier when it comes to the franchise's standards of voice acting, as unlike previous installments, it's the first Resident Evil game where the dialogue is intentionally funny, and unlike its successors, it knows better than to take its own typical dumb and far-fetched premise so seriously. When considering just how cheesy the script really is, it's actually impressive how the voice acting is nailed by pretty much everyone in the cast. People give Ashley a hard time all the time, but with all due respect, Carolyn Lawrence did an excellent job portraying her. But there is one voice actor in this game who truly went above and beyond, and that is Paul Mercier. Paul Mercier is the voice actor for both Leon and, get this, the Merchant. How cool is that? Did you know that? I didn't. Not until a few years ago. They sounded nothing alike, and that is incredible. This voice actor did such a phenomenal job that it can be argued that RE4 might not even have turned out as legendary or iconic as it did if it wasn't for him. And now we move on to the final piece of the puzzle, the piece that distinguishes RE4 from 5 and 6. As mentioned earlier in the video, survival horror is a unique genre in the sense that it isn't solely identified through gameplay like all the others, but through the emotions associated with horror as well. I've given plenty of examples in other chapters so far, but the one thing that always tells you whether a Resident Evil game is action-adventure or a survival horror game is to look at the tone it's trying to establish through sound. And the easiest indicator of them all is music. Resident Evil 4's pacing relentlessly shuffles between horror, action, levity, and serenity. The soundtrack expertly channels all of these different emotions, switching rapidly from one to the other to enhance that tonal whiplash at the core of RE4's identity.
Soon its stock prices crashed, and for all intents and purposes, Umbrella was finished. Six years have passed since that horrendous incident. I received special training via a secret organization working under the direct control of the president.
The game uses its two-part opening to showcase its tonal dichotomy and immediately set up that whiplash. The first part, Leon's monologue about the Umbrella downfall, is backed up by grandiose, perhaps even conspiratorial music. The second part cuts to the drive and a flamenco kicks in, setting a completely different tone. It's an effective smoke and mirrors tactic, designed to throw you off guard with a false sense of security. Putting these two different tonalities back to back is kinda like observing two televisions at a store or watching a graphics comparison video back in the days of the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3. If the two aren't next to each other, both of them would lack the juxtaposition required to amplify both of their respective strengths and weaknesses. In Resident Evil 4, the juxtaposition has the same effect. The levity that comes right after the horror is amplified because it lets go of so much emotional baggage and tension all at once, and the horror that shows up right after the levity is amplified because it kicks into full gear out of nowhere. It's the same principle behind the sigh of relief you get when you get to a safe room, followed by the fear that ensues upon exiting, except now it is tailored and recontextualized for a hyperlinear experience. The tug of war between action and horror extremes helps to widen the emotional spectrum. It makes it difficult to anticipate where the next tonal shift is going to happen, and in a weird way, that unpredictability in and of itself works as an element of horror. One minute you're standing your ground in the village while this plays in the background. Then in the next, you're in a farm. It's all spooky, eerily creepy, and quiet all at once. Shortly thereafter, Leon gets infected, and next thing you know, we're listening to this. It's interesting that the first full-on action music vibe starts right here, just after getting infected with the Las Plagas and kicking a ganado straight into a wall. That kick even scared the crap out of Luis. This is the first of the game's many implications that the Las Plagas is actually giving Leon some superhuman abilities. We were already aware of his impressive agility before the infection, thanks to the boulder chase, but it doesn't really explain the superhuman strength he develops over time, like how he can throw the harpoons over ridiculously long distances, or how the suplex attack only unlocks once you get to the castle, or how he can jump across chasms out of a flying minecart and grab on a ledge with just one hand, or how he was able to keep up with Krauser's even more advanced Plagas infection and superhuman abilities, or how could he dodge every laser beam in the next room. He can even run just fine after Ada stabs him in the leg, for crying out loud. At the end of the day, it might just come down to pure video game nonsense and over-the-top anime bullshit like in Code Veronica. But the reason why this might be a different situation is that RE4 as a game is miles ahead when it comes to being more well thought out. Obviously there are some oversights such as the Ditman glitch, but on a macro level, the game is so self-aware about its silliness that it wouldn't surprise me that Leon's impossible stunts were built around what the Las Plagas can do or the other way around, especially when you consider the previous working builds of the game and how the infection was supposed to play a much bigger role. Let's rewind back to the village and observe the soundtrack from here to the castle. The music tracks constantly zigzag from horror to action and back, but the instruments keep changing and the tempo keeps getting faster so that the franticism gradually turns into freneticism by the third act. Ever since the start of the franchise, Resident Evil was always trying to be the type of game where the power struggle at the beginning would turn into an all-out power fantasy by the end. Every other game has tried it before, but Resident Evil 4's Island would be the first to explore this transition of power dynamic to such an extent. Let's look at how the music progresses throughout. As you can hear, the tone of the music is almost exclusively action at this point, but the horror elements still linger all the way to the final boss, from the mysterious Oven Man to U3 to the Regenerators. What's interesting about the Regenerators is that when the last one approaches, the music track is omitted, as if the game is signaling that while they're still creepy, Leon is no longer fazed by them. It's best to think of the music as Leon's state of mind throughout the whole game. And then we get to the most grandiose and epic music track out of all of the soundtrack, the final boss theme. That percussion has power fantasy written all over it, with the background chorus still depicting an undertone of fear, forever cementing Leon as a badass with balls of steel. A while ago in the video I mentioned 2 ticking clocks, one for the cure and one for the escape. That means there's 2 things that require a payoff and you get 2 climactic moments. We get both of them back to back, and the Saddler Showdown was just the first one. The jet ski escape is the second and the true climactic moment of the game.
Hang on, sweetheart.
The tempo is extremely fast and the awesomeness meter is literally about to explode, just like the island.
Wait! Behind us!
I know, just hold on. Ashley! Where are ya?
Leon!
Come on. Let's go home.
Sounds like a great idea. Mission accomplished. Right, Leon?
Not quite. I still have to get you home safe.
From this point onward, the fear, the tension, and the nightmarish atmosphere has permanently vanished, and now replaced with a tone of accomplishment and happiness. For the first and last time, we hear music full of hope, optimism, and a sense of longing.
So, who was that woman anyway?
Why do you ask?
Come on, tell me.
She's like a part of me I can't let go. Let's leave it at that.
Resident Evil 4 is one of the most satisfying gaming experiences of all time. It took a long time to get to where it is now, discarding at least 4 previous builds and iterations as it went along. First announced in 1999, the first prototype, directed by Hideki Kamiya, was initially going to have a new protagonist called Tony Redgrave. He had superhuman abilities, and the game was centered around being cool and stylish. Shinji Mikami felt this was far too detached from what makes a survival horror game. However, the build showed so much promise that it continued development as a brand new IP, becoming the famous 2001 hack-and-slash game Devil May Cry. Development for Resident Evil 4 continued, entering the first of 3 different phases, also known as the Castle. Restarting in 2001 under the direction of Hiroshi Shibata, this would be known as the Fog version. It was the first build that would bring back Leon from Resident Evil 2 and had him infiltrating an Umbrella headquarters situated within a castle. This build brought back zombies as the main enemy and was supposed to feature a few gameplay mechanics set in first person, possibly similar to Code Veronica. The outbreak centered around the progenitor virus instead of the Las Plagas. Leon would still get infected, and the game featured a female character that was not Ashley, and she would be accompanied by a dog companion who was a BOW. This infection would grant Leon some sort of powers through his left hand. This was left out of the final game, but you can actually see it conceptually carried over to Krauser's mutation, which you can still activate as a special move in Mercenaries mode. This build ended up being discarded less than halfway through development, with only about 40% being actually finished, as the fog enemy created complications on the GameCube's hardware. However, not all was lost, as this script from this version was then used to create another horror game, Haunting Ground. The third build entered into the second phase known as Hallucination. This third build, called the Hookman demo, is by far the most popular one of them all, as this one actually has gameplay all over the internet and it seemed quite promising. This one took quite a dark turn, going for an even heavier horror vibe. It was gonna include paranormal elements such as hallucinations, animated dolls, and a ghost that would chase you around the castle with a hook for an arm. This build carries over many elements of the previous one, such as the script, the castle setting, the female character, and the dog, but it got reworked to fit better around the new premise of supernatural and paranormal horror and hallucinations. It's an impressive build that left fans such as myself and many others wondering how great it would have turned out. Unfortunately, just like the fog version, it would turn out to be too taxing on the GameCube hardware, as shifting between hallucinations and reality required the game to load two different versions of every room, and so it ended up on the chopping block as well. The game would then enter its third and final phase, known as the zombie phase. This was the last revision for the castle prototype, keeping the same story but eliminating every trace of the hallucinations and paranormal events. The zombies were brought back one last time, but this time they were controlled by parasites. These creatures were known as the Dabamen. The Japanese word daba roughly translates to pack horse or pack animal, which is very similar to how los ganados in Spanish translates to the word cattle. This build would be discarded extremely early in its production, as Shinji Mikami found this build to be formulaic and repetitive, so much so that it's possible that there is no working prototype for it that exists anywhere. However, the parasite concept was retained for the supposedly fifth and final build of Resident Evil 4. That final build would turn out to be one of the greatest decisions the video games industry's ever made. With the simple change of a more cinematic camera than ever before, Resident Evil 4 would go on to kill two birds with one stone, facilitating the ability to create in-depth combat mechanics and at the same time putting the horror up close and personal. It was the first of its kind, an aggressively confrontational survival horror game. There's lots of criticisms nowadays about how it's not a scary game because of the emphasis on action, but that's not really how horror games work. Action and horror are simply not mutually exclusive, and both of them have always been at the heart of survival horror. After all, if you don't take action to survive the horrors that await you, are you really surviving as much as you are just being passive and getting lucky? Repetition is the antithesis of horror. Resident Evil 4's unconventional take on the genre was unprecedented at the time, and it was anything but formulaic. The complaints about it being so different from the other Resi games are exactly what made it such a great survival horror game to begin with. From where I'm standing, Resident Evil 4 was not the downfall of survival horror, it was the first game to truly define it. It was the birth of the modern survival horror that we know today. Do I think it could have handled the horror elements a bit better? Yes, I do. I would have loved if the horror atmosphere was a bit more consistent the way it was in previous builds. Escaping the village at nighttime and playing the creepy basement section as Ashley, I believe those horror sections were some of the game's greatest moments, and I would have loved to have seen more of that emphasis. But at the same time, this game's greatest strength is that tonal whiplash of thrilling action, sudden bursts of body horror, and everything in between. It's what made it so effective at juggling palpable tension and unparalleled satisfaction. It's why, as much as I adore the psychological horror take of the hallucination build, I'm not sure I like it enough to replace the Resident Evil 4 we got. However, I also cannot deny that I've been curious ever since. The Resident Evil 4 remake does seem to be more concerned with bringing back those lost concepts than it is with recreating what we already have from the original, and though I have no doubt that many people will not be happy with that creative choice, I am completely okay with that. I am not expecting a Resident Evil 4 remake, I am expecting a Resident Evil 3.5 remake reimagined within the final version of Resident Evil 4. Could I be wrong on that? Sure. Will it live up to the original? If it's trying to stand out as something completely different, I don't think it even needs to. Resident Evil 4 is available on every platform under the sun, and by the time I will say goodbye to it once and for all, I think that a copy will still be easy to find for the next few decades. It's not going anywhere. I'm not sure if I will like the remake as much as the original, even though I could totally appreciate it for being a different take, but even if I don't, I've had nothing short of a blast with Resident Evil 4 over the last 17 years, and I'll have no problem cherishing it for 17 more. To say that Resident Evil 4 is a masterpiece, it just isn't enough. As of the date this video gets uploaded, it isn't just the greatest Resident Evil game ever made, it will always be one of the greatest games of all time. And with that, The Raven draws to a conclusion. Please look forward to an extension of this review, where I will be covering Assignment Ada, Separate Ways, and the Mercenaries mode. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.
Hasta luego.